I just want to do a quick review. I lost my voice again. Okay. Thank you very much. So we had 5 different shitas on what qualifies under the rule that the Mizbeach is koilet. In our Mishnah, we had Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua. They both said that anything that's oil ishim, anything that's going to be placed on the Mizbeach to be burned, like a carbon behema, like carbon of a mincha, is Rabbi Gamliel adds to it that anything that's put on the Mizbeach, even not leishim, like nesachim, would also be koilet by the Mizbeach. So that's Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua in our Mishnah. Then you had Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Kiva in the Brisa, and they said it has to dafka be a carbon only. It's just that Rabbi Kiva said that it could be any carbon. I'm sorry, Rabbi Kiva said that it could be any carbon, that's right, and even an oif, and Rabbi Yosy says it has to be a behemoth. So those were the 4 shitas, and then we had Rabbi Shimon who had an independent type of idea, and he said it all depends. If it's a standalone carbon, it doesn't matter what it is. If it's nesachim, if it's oifais, it's a mincha. If it's standalone, then the mizbeach is koilet. But if it's just an add-on to another carbon, the mizbeach is not koilet. The last thing we had was Rish Lakish said a chiddush that we know there's nesachim that are brought along with the carbon. You don't have to bring them the same day as the carbon. You can bring them up to 10 days later. So you would think that maybe that's considered a standalone nesachim because it was brought on a different day than its main carbon. Zoktin Rish Lakish that according to Reb Shimon, if it's connected to a carbon, even though it's brought on a different time, it's considered a connected carbon. And therefore, the Mizbeach will not be koilet. So those were the 5 shitas that we had about when the Mizbeach is koilet.
The art school doesn't give you a chart.
Rish Lakish gave us a chart.
I know, he gave us a chart. But they could have also. It's not typical of the art school.
Right, because this is perfect chart material.
Yeah, perfect chart.
This is perfect. The following list. Im olu lo yerdu. Following our list of items that Mizbeach is koilet. How long? So now we're not talking about what type of carbonis. We're talking about what type of pesulim. What type of pesulim do not disqualify the carbon from Klita? How long? It was let's say there was meat of the carbon, there was dam of the carbon, and it was not processed on time, it was left overnight. Now it's possible. You're not supposed to put it on the Mizbeach. If you did, Mizbeach would be koilet. The Yosy. We learned all about Yosy on Shabbos. If meat or dam left the Azara, it becomes possible, not tamei. And if it became tamei, they said mishchat chutz l'zmanei v'chutz l'mkoim. Or if it was pigel, or Kiblu Pesulim, the Kabbalah Hadam, that's supposed to be done by a Kohen, was done by somebody who was not qualified. Now, the Gemara is going to tell us that if it was somebody who wasn't qualified, that's not what this is referring to. The Gemara is going to tell us that this is referring to if it's somebody that was Tamei, and that's why he wasn't qualified. And we're going to see why. Rabbi Yehuda says, now the Gemara is going to tell us that the list of Pesulim that we just read, the reason why in Olu Yerdu is because each one of these have a similar situation where it would actually be kosher. And therefore, they're not so bad. They have some connection to a scenario that would be placed on the Mizbeach. And therefore, we say in Olu Yerdu. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, there's 3 exceptions. Shenishchat balayla, if a carbon was shechted at night, or v'nishbach dama, its dam got spilled out right away. There was never a Kabbalah dam, or v'yotza dama chutz l'kloim, If the dam left the confines of the Azara, they're also terid. So we're going to see in the Gemara why Rabbi Yehuda singles out these three psulim where we say the Mizbeach is not koilet. Rabbi Shimon argues on Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, terid. Even these three psulim, if you put them on the Mizbeach, they stay there. So Rabbi Shimon said, Kol shepsuloi b'kodesh. Any psul that occurs when it's kodesh. This is a very disputed term. So let's see how Rashi describes this term. Kol shepsuloi b'kodesh, hakodesh mekabloi. If its psul was b'kodesh, then the Mizbeach will be kodesh. Lo yhaya psuloi b'kodesh. Let's just see how Rashi translates Psula B'Kodesh. Calls Psula B'Kodesh the Gemara Yalef time. I'm sorry. Shahaya Psula B'Kodesh Yishabos Lazar and Nifsala. So Rashi says if it became possible after it came to the Azara, then the Mizbeach will be kodesh. So normally, at what point does a behema come to the Azara? After you already designated as a carbon. So if it became possible after it had been designated as a carbon, then it will be kodesh. But if it's possible for a carbon even before it was designated, like it was a balmum, so it could never have become a carbon, that the Mizbeach would not be kodesh. That is the pashat pshat in Rashi, but in a moment we're going to run into a problem. The following list are items that are not psulim b'kodesh, meaning the psul occurred before the animal became a carbon. Harayva v'anirva. If it was raiva nirva, it was never royu to be a carbon in the first place. Fraktoisvis, that's not true. What if someone was makadosh a carbon, and they're bringing the animal into the azara, and in the azara it was raiva v'nirva? So you can have a case of raiva v'nirva that was psulim b'kodesh. So how could the Mishnah say it's very possible for the Raiva Nirva to occur after it became Kodesh? So that is the main problem that we have here. So the Achreidim get involved. The Brisk Rav learns in Rashi, when Rashi says Rashi says it means a psul that's Kodesh means it's a psul that could not possibly have occurred before the animal became a carbon. Lun, Yosy, those are psulim that cannot possibly happen before it's a carbon. Lun and Yosy are only possible by a carbon. But Raiva V'nirva, which technically could have happened before it became a carbon, that's not psulim b'kodesh. So that's what a Brisker Rav learns pshat in Rashi. Okay, so Va'elu shalahayu psulim b'kodesh, Raiva V'nirva, via muktzah. Muktzah means it was set aside to be a avodah zarah. But it was served as an avodah zarah. Esnan. Muktzah could also mean it was set aside to be used as an accessory for avodah zarah. Esnan, an animal that was used as payment to a zaymah. Mechir, an animal that was used as payment for the purchase of a dog. Va'klayim, if the behemoth is klayim. Va'treifa of a streifa. Va'yotzer doifin, a animal that came out through a C-section is not right to be a carbon. An animal that, in order for an animal to be right for a carbon, it has to be born through a natural birth. And balimuman. These are all problems that would have occurred or could have occurred before the animal became a carbon. They disqualify an animal from becoming a carbon. That's correct. That's correct. So according to the Brisker Rav, the pshat is good. Since it could occur before, it's not called Psula B'Kodesh. The Brisker Rav Psula B'Kodesh doesn't mean it had to have happened before. If it could have happened before, that's enough to say that it would disqualify the carbon from Alolaya. Amun could also have occurred before. Amun could have also occurred before. But if it has a mum right now, it's possible to be a carbon. Rabbi Kiva Machshir the Balim. Rabbi Kiva says a balmum it doesn't mean kosher, it means im ololo yerdu. And Rashi tells us, how could Rabbi Kiva say that a balmum im ololo yerdu? Zokt Rashi, the Gemara is going to tell us that Rabbi Kiva is not talking about any balmum. He's talking about a very subtle mum called dukin shaba'ayin, which which by oifos aren't a mum at all. So therefore, this type of mum doesn't really disqualify. Rab Chanina Skana Kehanim Omer, Doicha Haya Abba Es Bale Mum Melkabe Mizbeach. My father was very strict. Abba Mum could not be on the Mizbeach. If it was put on the Mizbeach, he would throw it right off, which is consistent with what Reb Shimon said a moment ago. I'm sorry? That I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. We'll have to see the Gemara. That's a good question. I don't know what he's referring to. Because really this whole comment from Reb Chanina's Kanakianim is a weird comment. What's so special about him? Reb Shimon holds the same thing. Why is he so busy with Mumin? What about all the other Pesulim? So I'm not sure what he's talking about. So maybe it is speaking about Shabbat. I guess we'll see in the Gemara. Kishem Shem Alu Lo Yerdu. The same way we have halacha that if this item was placed on the Mizbeach and shouldn't have been placed there, you leave it there. Kach im Yardu Lo Yalu. If you took it off the Mizbeach, don't put it back on. And any animal that was alive when it was brought up to the Mizbeach, Yerdu, that you always take off. It's only animals that have already been shechted that have this rule. And there's going to be a discussion about it. Because what if an animal was alive, but it would be possible? So if you take it off the Mizbeach and you shecht it, you won't be able to put it back on. So maybe those animals you'd be able to leave on the Mizbeach, even though they're chayim, and maybe shecht them there. So there'll be a discussion about that. Oila shall also chayel Rosh Mizbeach. Carbon oila, that they brought it up to the Mizbeach while it was alive. Tered, you take it down. You know why? Because we know when you shecht it, you'll be able to bring it back up. What happens if shecht of a Rosh Mizbeach? And this is going to be a big controversy tomorrow, what this is talking about. Shecht of a Rosh Mizbeach, if you shecht the oila on the Mizbeach, yavshit, you process it like a regular oila. You skin it, and the skin goes to the kahanim. And you cut it up into pieces on top of the Mizbeach. There's going to be a lot of discussion about this in the Gemara, because all the other pieces of the oila, yes, put it on the Mizbeach, but we know that the stomach area, the intestines, contain very not pleasant items that normally have to be washed out and cleaned out before it's placed on the Mizbeach. So the question is, how do you just cut it and put it on? Don't the intestines need to be cleaned out? So that'll all be part of the discussion. Tanya Zakta Gemara, Tanya Rabbi Yehuda. It says in the pasuk, Zois hiya oila. Now these aren't consecutive words, but these three words are in the pasuk, and they're all mi'utim. So let's just look at the pasuk itself. We learned it yesterday. Daber el aharon ve'elbon of lemar. Zois. That's a miyut. Dafka this and not something else. So from this pasuk we're learning that the Mizbeach is koilet, but there's three miyutim in the pasuk to exclude three items from the list. So Zois, Toiras, ha'oila, he. So he dafka this and not another one. Ha'oila, not another one. Zois dafka this. So from these three miyutim, we exclude three items from the list. Let's see Rashi. Zois Toiras, Zois ha'oila. Zois is a mi'uta. He is a mi'uta. And Heida ha'oila is also a mi'uta. The mashma ha'oila ha'mayuchedes k'sheira. Only a specific one is what we're referring to, that Mizbeach is koilet. Lemute asu shafilu alu yardu. It's telling us that there's three items that even if it's alu, you'll take them off. Don't say that this idea that the Mizbeach is koilet is universal with no exceptions. There are exceptions. Mistaver the hani memayit shepsulon l'fnei zrika. The Gemara is going to conclude that the likelihood is the ones that don't get the benefit of this Mizbeach being koilet are karbanis that became puzzle before the zrika. So Rabbi Yehuda talks about if it was nishchata balayla, that became puzzle before the zrika. It was shechted at the wrong time. Nishbach doma, it became puzzle before the zrika. Right? Or sheshachtu pesulim. These are all pesulim that occurred before the zrika. While on the other hand, alone, if you did the zrika and then the meat stayed overnight, that's a pesul that would have occurred after the zrika. The Gemara is going to explain later, how do we know other Pesulim? How do we know they don't go down? How do you know which ones to pick to be Mamayit from this? What did he say yes to? What did he say no to? The Pesulim is Rika. What about Pigel? Pigel is included in the list of items that in Olu Lo Yerdu. But there's also a Pesul that occurred before. That's also a Pesul that occurred before the Rika. So how do you know what to say is included and what to say is not included? That's what the Gemara is going to explain. So let's see the Gemara weiter. To tell us that there's three karbonas that are not included, or three psulim that are not included in this halacha that the Mizbeach is koiled. A prat shenishchat b'layla, v'shenishbach dama, v'sheyotza dama chutz l'klayim. All these three psulim that occurred before the Zrika, Shim also tered. If they placed on the Mizbeach mistakenly, they still get taken off the Mizbeach. And that is the reasoning for Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda learns these three things are excluded because of the three mi'utim that he found in the pasuk. But Rabbi Shimon argues. Rabbi Shimon Aimer Ayla, any Ayla, I would think only Ela Ayla Kshera. I would have only thought that a kosher carbon goes on the Mizbeach. But a non-kosher Ayla maybe does not remain on the Mizbeach. Inayin the rabbis shenishchot habalayla v'shenishbach dama v'sheyotza dama chutz l'kloyim. So these are the three psulim that Rabbi Yehuda specifically excluded from the halacha that the Mizbeach is koiled. Zok Rabbi Shimon, no, they are included along with the long list of other psulim. Halon, v'yotzei, v'atamei, v'shenishchot chutz l'zmanoi, v'chutz l'kloimoi, v'shekiblu psulim, v'zorku es damoi, hanitne l'mata, shenitne l'mayla. Dam of an oila that you spritzed lamaila where you should have spritzed the chatos, or vice versa. Lamaila shenas lamata. These are all psulim. A korban whose dam was supposed to be spritzed on the mizbeach chitzon, and you spritzed it on the mizbeach pnimi. Or b'pnim shenas b'chutz. These are all psulim. Upesach the chatos sheshachtin shalei l'shemon. Now, this really tickles our memory. This takes us back to the first mission of the Masechta. All karbonos that you shechted shalom lishmon are kosher. The only two karbonos that exist that if you shechted shalom lishmon it's possible is the chatos and the pesach. Minayin, how do you know that even though these are all psulim, how do you know that if you placed them on the mizbeach, that you would still? How do you know if you placed them on the mizbeach in ololo yerdu, you still leave them there? Zok to Gemara. We know it. Talmud Leimer, Torah ha'oila. So Torah ha'oila is a ribui. So we had Zois hi ha'oila are miyutim, but Torah ha'oila is a ribui. Torah achas l'chol ha'oilim. This is a universal halacha that the Mizbeach is koiled. She'im olu lo yerdu. Yochel, I would have thought that there's literally no limit to what's included in this rule. Yochel shani marba hadoiva, va nerva, va mukza, va nevad, va esnan, umichir, uchlaim, utreva, yotzidoiven. Tabalam results. Even Reb Shimon holds that there's a red line. Even Reb Shimon holds that there are psulim that are not included in this because of the meat of the zois. So, Frank the Gemara. So, Reb Shimon, how do you decide what should be included from the ribui of Torah Sa'ilam? And what should be excluded because of the miyut of Zois? My rose, the rabbi says, Elu, Ulhaitu is Elu, Akar Shariba Hakosov. Yes, you have a ribui from the pasuk. Yes, you have a miyut. But how do you know how to apply that ribui? How do you know how to apply that miyut? Zakti Gemara, Shimon's reasoning is, Marbanias Elu. I'm going to include the entire list that I included. Shahaya Psulon Bakoidish. Their psul was b'kodesh. Let's once again refer to the Briskerov's Prat of Rashi. These are all things whose psul could only have occurred after the korban was made. I'm excluding psulim psulim b'kodesh that could have happened even before. You could see there's long Tosfos in, and Tosfos has discussions about other options of what psulim b'kodesh could mean. Okay, that is the sheet of Reb Shimon, the main guiding principle as to what is included in the halach of the Mizbeach being koiled and what is not. is if it's a psul that could have occurred before it became a carbon, like a rival, like a neighbor, like a balmum, those Mizbeach are not koilet, but if it's a psul that could only have happened after it became a carbon, like pickle, it can't be pickle before it became a carbon. So those psulim are included in the umbrella. Rabbi Yehuda excludes 3 additional items that Rabbi Shimon included. How does he know that? So Rabbi Yehuda goes through the entire list in the Mishnah of why they're kosher. So there's lon, there's yotzei, there's tamei, there's 5 psulim that Rabbi Yehuda agrees in Olo Yerdu. And now he's going to explain one by one why these aren't such fatal flaws. And therefore, we say on those in Olu Lo Yerdu. So let's have a look in the Gemara here. Lon is one of the psulim that Rabbi Yehuda holds in Olu Lo Yerdu. You know why? Because lon isn't such a bad psul. Why not? Shari lon kosher be'emurin. Emurin that were left overnight, they're possible. But if you place them on the Mizbeach wrongfully, we say in Olu Lo Yerdu. So therefore, since it applies to emurin, let's say it also applies to dam. Well, I might ask you, why does it apply to emurin? Maybe emurin also shouldn't be allowed to remain on the Mizbeach. Zok to Gemara, be'emurin kosher, sharei lon kosher bebasar. You know why? If you put emurin on the Mizbeach after it stayed overnight, where it's really possible, but you placed it on the Mizbeach wrongfully, you know why it's kosher? Because by basar, you find, if you put basar on the Mizbeach, the next day, by basar you find if you eat the basar the next day, it will be kosher. Where do you ever find eating basar the next day is kosher? By a carbon shlamim. By a carbon shlamim, you have a situation where you can eat the basar the day after the carbon was brought, and that's perfectly fine. So since you see that concept of basar remaining overnight, it's enough to click it and connect it to a murin that we're not allowed to stay overnight, that left overnight, that even though the chatchila you can't put them on the Mizbeach, but if you put them on the Mizbeach, you won't take them off. Once you see that principle by a murin, we'll extend it to down. Of course, the Gemara is going to ask very shortly, what type of comparison is that? That's the way you're supposed to do it. By the Shlomim, you're supposed to do it that way. That's why it's kosher. How could you compare something that you're supposed to do it this way to something that you're doing wrong? I'm sorry? That's right. Other korbanos you wouldn't be allowed to. The Gemara doesn't draw an example from there. The Gemara draws an example from something where that's the halacha, how it's supposed to be done like chatchila, and the Gemara is going to ask that question too. Yosy, why is Yosy not so bad that Rabbi Yehuda holds in Olu Lo Yerdu? Because Yosy kosher b'bama. We found by the Bamais there was never a problem of Yosy because there was no perimeter there. So you see, Yosy is not such a bad thing. Therefore, in Olu Lo Yerdu. What about Tamei? Tamei is easy. Sometimes lechatchila, a Tamei is allowed to do the avodah if it's a carbon tzibur. So therefore, Tamei is not such a bad psul. If the person was Tamei when he did the avodah, it will still in Olu Lo Yerdu. What about pigul? We know by chutz l'zmanoi you continue doing all the avodas, because otherwise you won't be pigul. Remember we said that if someone has kavoda to eat it chutz l'zmanoi and then he doesn't do the avodas, it's not pigul. It's only pigul if he follows through and does all the avodas. So you see, even pigul you have to do all the avodas on. So pigul can't be so bad either. And chutz l'goymoi hoyel ve'iskish chutz l'zmanoi. It's compared to chutz l'zmanoi. The problem is, what about kiblu psulim v'zarku as domai? Where do you ever find that it would be kosher? Where do you ever find if a Yisrael, if a Balmum, if an Isha does avodah, does kabbalah and shrikas adam, it will be kosher? You never find such a thing. Are true. In fact, those in Olu Yerdu, you know what type of psulim we're talking about? The Hanach psulim, the chozul avodas tzibur. We're only talking about what type of puzzle did avodah? Someone who could have done it avodas tzibur. And who's that? Someone who's tamei. Someone who's possible to do the avodah because he's tamei. If he was makabel the dam and made drink of the dam, the carbon is possible. But in olu lo yerdu. Frag the Gemara, in the case of dam that was lon, you're saying the reason why it's not so bad because a murim that were lon also olu lo yerdu. And the murim that were lon the olu lo yerdu because of shlomim you could eat on the second day. Frag the Gemara, if he done it, davar shaloi bech sheroi, midavar shebech sheroi, you can't prove that the lon of Isser that you weren't allowed to do won't be so bad because a shlomim you could eat for 2 days. You have to compare it to something that was done improperly that still goes on the Mizbeach. Zok, you're right. The svaras that we just offered aren't a real reason why Rabbi Yehuda holds that in Alu Lo Yerdu. It's really a Gzeres HaKosov. Tana Azois Toiras Ha'oila Riba Samachli. The real reason is because there's Toiras Ha'oila to include all karbonis, and there's Zois Hiya Oila that are Mamayit 3 karbonis. It's a Gzeres HaKosov. Now, how do we interpret, how do we understand what the Gzeres HaKosov is? We use these svaras, but they don't have to be such perfect svaras because it's not the svara that's dictating what's Olul Yerdu and what's Olul Yerdu. It's the Gzeres HaKosov. The svara is helping us apply the Gzeres HaKosov. And therefore, yes, it's not such a good comparison from Dover Shaloi Bech Sheiroi, Mi Dover Shebech Sheiroi, but that's not really the source anyway. The source is really the Gzeres HaKosov. So just to do a quick review so we can process the part of the Mishnah that we did so far. Oops. My camera just went dead. Let me just turn it on again. Okay, so in the Mishnah, it lists off what type of Pesulim are included. So the first list of Pesulim, everybody agrees that they are included in Oloyer. Rabbi Yehuda makes 3 exceptions because he says Zoy Sia Oila are excluding 3 specific Pesulim from this rule of Oloyer, and he applies them to Nishchat Balayla, Nishbach Dama, and Yotza Dama, Chutz L'Chaim. Rab Shimon doesn't hold of those miutim. Rab Shimon just holds there's 1 ribui and 1 miut, and therefore the ribui will include anything that was psuloi b'kodesh, and the miut would exclude anything that was not psuloi b'kodesh. So those are the 2 main shitas in how this looks. I want to put. We have a little bit of time, so I want to push on a little bit because tomorrow is more of a longer daf. So let's use today to get into tomorrow's daf. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Hashoichet behema, someone shechted an animal that was a carbon, and he shechted it by night, bifnim. So this is now a pasul of carbon, because you're not supposed to shech b'layla. And then behela b'chutz. Now we know there's an isser. If you take a carbon and you makriv it on the Mizbeach that you built outside of the Azara, you're chayiv koris. It's called shchutei chutz or halos chutz. What if it was a pasul of carbon? Here you have a carbon that you shechted by night, so it's a pasul of carbon, and then you made halah b'chutz. Zok Rabbi Yochanan, even though it's a pasul of carbon, you are still chayiv for shchutei chutz. Let's see Rashi. Hashoichet behema b'layla b'fnim. The hela oisam b'chutz chayiv. Why? Mishum mayla b'chutz. Zok Rabbi Yochanan, never mind. According to Rab Shimon, who holds that this animal, if you shechted it by Laila, you're not supposed to put it on the Mizbeach. But if you did put it on the Mizbeach, you would leave it here. Even according to Rab Yehuda, who holds that shechet by Laila, if you mistakenly put it on the Mizbeach, you have to remove it. So it's so possible that you have to remove it if you put it on the Mizbeach. Even according to Rab Yehuda, if you made halah, b'chutz, if you put this animal on the Mizbeach b'chutz, it's completely possible. It's so possible that if you put it on the Mizbeach by mistake, you take it off, you're still chayiv for shechit chutz. If you do Rabbi Yehuda, the Omar also b'fnim teireit. Surely, hanach dem olu lo yerdu. You're surely chayiv for halah b'chutz if it was a different psul that you would be able to leave on the Mizbeach. There's surely the chayiv al hala osam b'chutz kidarim perka shoichet. The miskabel mifnim. The rule is any animal that under any circumstances would be accepted b'fnim, even if it's possible, but there are circumstances that if you wrongfully place it on the Mizbeach, it would still be accepted because you don't take it off the Mizbeach. Any animal that has a remote connection to be somewhat accepted b'fnim, if you're milet b'chutz, you will be chayiv kares. Zogt Rabbi Yochanan afilu hach Rabbi Yehuda chay. Even Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that this animal is completely rejected from b'fnim, because even if you placed it on the Mizbeach b'fnim, you would throw it off the Mizbeach, you're still chayiv for shchut chutz. Big chiddush. Zogt the Gemara, right there. The reason for it is a simple logical argument. If I took an animal that was a carbon and I shechted it outside of the Beis Hamikdash, and then I was a makrivit outside of the Beis Hamikdash, I'm chayiv kares sai for the shechita and sai for putting it on the Mizbeach. Now think about it. Shechting it balayla can't be any worse than shechting it b'chutz. Since we know for a fact that if you shecht something b'chutz and you're a milet b'chutz, you're chayiv twice, you're chayiv malchus twice. So if you shechted it inside and we're milet outside, should for sure also be chayiv for the halal. So it's a logical argument. Most of Rabbi Bar Avin has a kasha on this assertion that Rabbi Yochanan made, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, you'd be chayiv for Allah b'chutz, even though it was shechted at night. What is the kasha? We know if you shecht an oif, a carbon, it's a nevela, because there's no such thing as shechting an oif that's a carbon. It's only malika that works. Shechita doesn't work on the oif that's a carbon. So the Allah is a sheichet oif b'fnim. What if you shechted an oif b'fnim? Umayla b'chutz, and then you put it on the Mizbeach outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Potter. There you're potter. So basically in a parallel case by an oif, it would be potter. But shochat b'chutz umayla b'chutz. But if you did it all b'chutz, it would be chayiv. Based on your reasoning, Rabbi Yochanan, why don't you say something by oif? Nema lois hey b'chusa mishoichet umayla b'chutz. If shoichet umayla b'chutz gets you twice chorus for shchita b'chutz and Allah b'chutz, why shouldn't you be chayiv if you made shchita b'fnim? The same argument as Rabbi Yochanan made, according to Rabbi Yehuda, by a behema, why wouldn't you make by a knife? And because of this kasha, Zokt Gemara Tiyufta. You're right, Rabbi Yochanan is Augustlagel. And in fact, if you shechted balayla, it's a puzzle, a carbon, and Rabbi Yehuda holds Alu Yerdu, and Alu Yerdu, it's rejected from the Mizbeach, and therefore if you made Allah b'chutz, you would be potter. But the Gemara has another teretz. There's a very big difference between shechting a knife in the Azara and shechting an animal balayla. If you shecht an animal balayla, it is a shchita. It's a shchita. The animal's not an avela. Yet, it's not a kosher shchita for the carbon, but it's a kosher shchita. But if you make shchita on the oif that's a carbon in the Beis Hamikdash, that's like you ripped its head off. It's nothing. Shchita is nothing for a carbon inside the Beis Hamikdash. So therefore you'll be potter. But shchita of an animal balayla, it might be a possible carbon, but it's still a legitimate shchita. As Rashi says, mikdal katle loy shaycha shchita b'fnim klal loy b'chulim loy kapkachim. There is no shchita. Is nothing. Shchita is like putting a bullet in its head when you're inside the azar. It's nothing. It has no value. Only malika is the proper way to slaughter an animal inside the azar. Abo shchita slayla, but when you shecht an animal at night, shchita hi b'chulim is a perfectly good shchita. Hilchach b'kachim. Yeah.
At night.
So it's a good shchita. The animal's not an avela, but it's a puzzle of carbon. But it's a shchita psula. So therefore, there it makes sense that it's kosher enough that you will be chayiv for halal b'chutz. But shechting a knife is like ripping its head off, and that's a regular nevela, and therefore you'll be put. Okay, we'll learn. So it's not an nevela, but
It's olelo, אני יודע.
I'm sorry?
say that אם שחט בשבת,
Right.
חטאת יחיד,
Right.
זה olelo.
Well, yeah, but you mechal Shabbos, but shechita is chil Shabbos.
Yeah, but the olelo.
But it's still kosher carbon. Could be, yeah.
It's what's the difference between Balayla and Shabbat. Shabbat
Because
is
by Laila it's not a kosher carbon. If you shech by Laila, the carbon is not kosher.
Shabbat חטאת זה גם לא קשור.
But you just told me that it's a kosher. You just told me that
I
it's
know
kosher.
that
Because you might be violating. No, it's very simple. You might be violating Shabbos, but you're doing the carbon properly. If you shech by Laila, you're not checking the carbon properly. When you shech by Shabbos, you're doing the perfect avodah for the carbon. There's a technicality. You're not allowed to do it on Shabbos. So that doesn't go into the actual carbon. Okay. The next Gemara I just want to learn because it's chazering something that we just learned yesterday. Omar Ula, a murei kadeshim kalim, shehelon lefnei zrikas dam. The murim of a shlomim, when do you put them on the Mizbeach? Only after the zrika, right? What happens if you did it before the zrika? It's possible. Nevertheless, lo yerdu. Don't take it down because nasu lachmo shel Mizbeach. Once it's placed on the Mizbeach, it's not a lach Mizbeach. The Gemara asked yesterday, why is this any different than the Kmitza that I didn't put into a Klesharis? That's not ready to be placed on the Mizbeach, and the Basar is not ready to be placed on the Mizbeach. So the Gemara said the difference is, if you put Kosher Kalam on the Mizbeach before Zrika, the meat itself requires no adjustment. It's ready to go. There's a side technicality, you need to make Zrika Sadah. But if the Kmitza wasn't placed in the Klisharis, the Kmitza itself is not ready yet to be placed on the Mizbeach. And therefore, by the Kmitza, you'll say him Olu Yerdu, but the Kachim Kalim, you'll say him Olu Yerdu. And it's Nasalach Mishal Mizbeach. Okay, so we'll stop here and we'll continue tomorrow.
Sheikh.
Go ahead.